The fact that something like Marvel couldn't get you to the point where you're turning profit, that then, those steady, reliable projects are supposed to bankroll the risky stuff, the new IPs, the real home run swings that might in the future become, your Fortnite or whatever, Five Nights at Freddy's. You need strong, reliable foundations, and that's what a partnership with somebody like Marvel does, even if they're having to give a bunch of the profits in licensing fees back to Marvel. And I think Marvel being an American company and NetEase specifically and in a high profile way, sort of pulling out of the United States tells you that there is that connection there, right? Like they are probably not looking at doing licensing deals with American companies as much, as maybe you would have expected after the success of Rivals.
Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday. I'm Jeremy,
I'm Alan.
and we want to welcome you back to GG Everybody, your ultimate pop culture podcast where we hit start on all things geek. From video games and comic books to tabletop RPGs, tech trends, and beyond, we're here to level up your fandom. Whether you're a console warrior, a dungeon master, or just someone who loves diving deep into geek culture, we've got something for you. Each episode, we tackle the biggest topics, hot takes, and hidden gems across your favorite fandoms. So grab your dice, charge your controllers, get ready to geek out. We are thrilled to be welcoming back a familiar face. We're getting this podcast up and running. We're getting people lined up. We're getting guests. We got some really exciting stuff coming up. Mike Drucker coming in a couple weeks, and all kinds of fun stuff. And in the midst of all this, we had an opportunity to bring back the one and only Aidan Moher. Aidan, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Welcome
Hey,
back, Aidan.
thank you. Thanks for having me back. I had a blast on the very first episode, and now I'm back again. You can't get away from me. And I didn't know you guys got Mike Drucker coming on a future episode. He's the best, and his book, I had a chance to read it a couple of weeks ago, and it's wonderful.
Yeah. We both have a review copy, so we're going to dig into that before he comes on, so we can make sure to as part of like the interview process, we'll at the beginning we're going to spotlight that. It's called Good Game to Rematch It. Rematch. If you haven't heard of it, listeners, definitely check it out. It definitely has, at least in my initial like chapter or so that I've read, some similar vibes to kind of Aiden's book with fight magic items, but Drucker's humor, if you're not familiar with how Mike Drucker writes, you are going to have a great time reading this book. It's so much fun and very relatable. And so it's going to be a good time. But yeah, we got Drucker coming on. And I think we've got a couple other folks that we're trying to get lined up. I'm proud to say that Jason Schreier has declined to come on the show, but he did respond. So we reached out to Jason just to see if he would join us. Unfortunately, his schedule, of course, is very packed. But in any case, we are very excited and happy to again be welcoming Aidan back on and getting folks lined up for the show. If you're out there listening, if you're a game dev, if you're in comics, if you're in tabletop gaming, we want to spotlight you. We want to spotlight your work. And so yeah, reach out. We'll be happy to get you on the books. Okay. Well, all that said, Aidan, it's been a while. We were just saying before we started recording, last time we talked to you was before the inauguration. And it's been a long decade since the inauguration. So, what have you been up to? What are you playing lately?
I've been playing a lot of different games. I can't talk about what I'm playing right now. I'm under embargo,
Okay,
which is
redacted.
like a novel
Redacted.
thing
Got it.
for me. Yeah, redacted.
Yep.
But I think anybody who understands sort of the beat or has read the book that I wrote will appreciate the game that I'm playing. I'm enjoying it a lot and can probably talk about it more next week. I've
Okay.
also been playing a game called Eternal Strands, which is something I did not know about until it came out. Like I was not following its development at all. But it's a double A game from a studio from like with Mike Laidlaw, who used to work at BioWare, and it's an action RPG that has sort of like doesn't have roguelike elements because like you're not dying and restarting, but it has like a progression system where you're kind of going out through these environments and making a little bit more progress, a little bit more progress over time. It sort of reminds me of Hades with a really
Mhm,
strong cast, great writing, and then like Kingdoms of Amalur, which is like sort of
mhm,
a double A uh fantasy RPG from a number of years ago, like Kingdoms of Amalur without the whole like Kurt Schilling thing. And it just blends so many different things that I really like about action games. It has these big, huge, scalable um, monsters, so it kind of has some Shadow of the Colossus in there. It has this like really interesting, fun crafting mechanic where you're going out and you're having to collect, stone and metal and thread and then what you bring in, there's different types of thread. So as you make armor with it, the type of thread you use will determine if it's strong against fire or if it's strong against ice, but also
mm.
like if it's blue or red or whatever. So there's just
Yeah,
like
yeah.
real strong element of like player engagement and agency in like combat, in the world, in the way you puzzle solve, in the way that you create your character. It's just really fun, and it blew me away. I didn't know anything about it, and then I started playing it, and I was like, This game is amazing. It's got this really cartoony fantasy art style that reminds me of like the best of Blizzard. Like it's kind of like World of Warcrafty, just everything. Like it just checks every one of my boxes, and I don't know how I missed it until it came out. But that was a big
Yeah.
one for me lately.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now, and some a bunch of people like the when if you Google it, you see all the information and stuff, and all the Google stuff that it throws up at the top of the page now. But then you see a bunch of Reddit threads that are like, "How did I not know about this game?" Like,
Yeah.
a bunch of pleasantly surprised people. And yeah, no, this looks awesome. And I was gonna make a joke like I like my game studios like I like my batteries, double A. That's a
Yeah.
that's a sweet spot, I feel like,
And I
like
I
for
feel like
development.
there's so much room for this type of game, like this double A game from smaller indie studios, and maybe we'll get
Mhm.
into that a little bit later, but, as the
Yeah.
market gets it topples under the weight of, like, triple A game development. I look at Eternal Strands, and it came out at 39.99 American, I think a little bit
Mhm.
49.99 Canadian here, but, like,
Mhm.
in that lower price range, and the amount of value I get from it is just so far and beyond, like, that kind of budget price range, it just why aren't there more games like this?
Yeah.
We'll
Yeah.
see how sales go. We'll see how the indie studio does, as they kinda progress, but I would love to see more of it.
Yeah.
It's on
No,
Game Pass too. So for those of you who have Game Pass, you
Yeah,
can
it is
check
on
it
Game
out.
Pass. I think that's sorta how it got legs because it was on Game Pass at release and people were like, "Hey, I checked out this game from, Laidlaw and it's really cool." And then I found out about it and, everybody just sorta, like, snowballed from there, and Game Pass, I think, absolutely helped.
yeah. And we've talked about that, right? I mean, I think I mean, not just us, obviously. Like, I think this is part of the broader conversation around Game Pass in general is like the opportunity for Game Pass to put these double A titles, these kind of mid range like indie titles into the hands of millions of gamers who are subscribed to the service. Um, like that is a power that should be wielded for good, right? So I think this is a great example of that. Um, and yeah, I think we'll dig a little bit more into like what success looks like in the modern industry here in a minute. But what about you, Alan? What have you been playing? What are you up to?
Uh Balatro, man. I'm still going at Balatro.
Dang, he's still hooked. He can't stop. I think we were talking about when Aiden was on here last time. Just nonstop
Probably, like,
Yes,
Balatro.
yeah.
Balatro's a game I cannot pick up, like, I can't like, if I look at my Switch and think about Balatro, I need to, like, go to the other room, otherwise
Yeah, you need to call your sponsor. You're
100%,
like,
yeah,
I can't.
100%, yeah.
Yeah.
Smart man, smart man. Cause like right now, like so you got your decks and you can do stakes to kind of make it more difficult for yourself. And like I completed I think I said last time I completed like one whole deck and then I started doing these challenges. So there's 20 different challenges that the game has and it basically imposes certain rules like uh one of the more interesting ones was the entire deck is glass cards and you're like this is sick, this is going to be so easy, but then they give you these two jokers that are eternal. You cannot get rid of them, you can't destroy them, you can't do anything about them. And what they do is that they basically double the probability, which basically means that your glass cards are going to break every single time that you use them. So basically, then it becomes a race to I need to get to that last uh blind in order to finish this game. Because if you're just kind of like, throwing out hands willy nilly, you're going to be out of cards.
Yeah.
So basically, I ended up making it to like the very last blind, the last boss blind, with 3 cards in my whole deck, and I beat it. So like right now, I've gotten 17 out of 20 challenges. So I got 3 left.
Dang. Well, good on you, man. I had mentioned I cleared it with a couple of decks, like 3 decks, I think. And I do go back to it, and it definitely has that like addictive factor to it. But I've been trying to like make progress on like story games and try and like work through my library a bit. I finally put Metaphor ReFantasio to bed. Um like I finally rolled credits on it like 3 days ago after grinding way too long. Um, like 87 hours or something.
I'm pretty sure
Um
we were talking about Metaphor the last time I was on too.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So like I finally got that game put to bed. I think it was probably at like 50 hours or something when we chatted last. So
Mhm.
that one's all done. And now I picked up Returnal. I went back to Returnal after a while because I'd seen some cool like any percentage speed runs and stuff. And I was like, oh yeah, that game was like super cool. So picked that up, faffed around with it a bit. But I think what's going to be next for me is Monster Hunter Wilds. Um, I'm seeing some interesting reviews out there, and so I'll probably spend some time with Monster Hunter, and then dig back into my backlog. So that's
Oh, I
what
also
I've been
wanted to
up
put
to.
out there that
Yep.
Balatro is on Game Pass now.
Oh
So
snap!
on your Xbox, on your PC, get that Balatro.
Everything's an Xbox on your refrigerator, on your microwave. Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, let's dig into it. Got a few well, 2 topics at least, maybe 3. We'll see. Both Aiden and I have a hard stop today, so we'll see how far we get. Um the first topic I wanted to talk about was what success looks like in the modern gaming industry. And this conversation is sort of sprouting out of the somewhat recent news that NetEase, which was the developers of Marvel Rivals, basically laid off a number of very high level employees that helped to develop Marvel Rivals as a game. And of course, if you look at Marvel Rivals, you see the success that it's had. It's got millions of players, building substantial revenue. By all accounts, you would look at that and objectively say, "Hey, this game is a success, right? This game made it." And yet, it is, at least to on the outside, right, from the outside looking in, this action seems like the action of a game that was not successful, right? Like we attribute layoffs with games that don't perform well. And so how do you circle that square or square that circle? So I guess, to kind of start off the conversation, you know I'd like to, Aiden, I'd like to get your initial thoughts on this because I'm sure you've probably had a bunch of people in your circles in your space that have been like, "What's going on here?" and like different, devil's advocate, conversations and all that stuff. Um, what are your initial thoughts on that when you heard that news?
Yeah, I mean, like pretty much everyone, my first thought went right to the idea of these sort of reactionary layoffs that we're seeing across the tech sector everywhere, right? No
Mhm.
matter what happens, your game can be a huge success. It can be a bomb. It can be right in the middle, and it always seems to end in layoffs. The NetEase thing is a little more complicated than that, or it's something else entirely. After the fact, it seemed to be reported that these NetEase layoffs were actually related to NetEase uh, pulling back from doing business in the United States, in Canada,
Mm.
and Japan, and trying to bring more of their business internal
Right.
to China, where they're from. And so I don't really fully know what to make of it. It seems like it's not sort of the 5 alarm fire, like, hey, like you can be one of the biggest smash hits, huge, financial success, and still undergo layoffs of important people because the people laid off were important. Layoffs are never good, right? Like it sucks that these people lost their job, that there wasn't an opportunity for them to be, like to find new roles, even if NetEase wants to ease off on business in the States. It is at least sort of a more traditional business decision style layoff, which is not as alarming as like reactionary, just like, oh, we need to get an extra 1/4% on our, our quarterly returns for investors.
Right. Yeah.
We're going to lay off a bunch of people.
Yeah.
Pulling business out of different regions is a thing that businesses do. And it sucks for the people caught up in the layoffs, but it's at least understandable. Doubly so because I think a lot of businesses, like here in Canada, we are responding very strongly to what has been happening in the United States, and that
Right.
involves pulling a lot of business out of the United States. And so
Yeah.
as a Canadian, I sort of see that reaction from NetEase, and I do wonder, like, is this sort of them looking at that region and saying, "Hey, this feels like a volatile space for us to do business in. Let's bring that internal. Let's try to bring that back to China." And that, like, it's not good. It's bad, and it's especially bad for the people laid off, but at least to me, there's some business sense or business logic there that does not apply to 99% of the other layoffs in gaming that we've been seeing.
Yeah. In a way, yeah, to your point, in a way, the layoffs at NetEase and with Marvel Rivals are alluding to very different circumstances than the layoffs that we're used to seeing.
Yeah,
And that is cause for concern and pause, right? Like I think you bring up an extremely valid point in terms of Canada's responses to the actions of this administration over the past month, as well as other international partners and business partners. And so that's definitely valid. I think also the idea that video games are essentially like it's a project, right? Like in project management, when something is done, right, you wrap it up, you get to the end step, you close it out, and you move on. You ramp down the resources that helped you to accomplish that project, right? Hopefully everybody gets to pop some champagne and enjoy, and it's on to the next for some of those resources, but typically not for all, right? Because whatever the next project is, in the absence of it being like a live service game or a direct sequel to an IP that has an incredible amount of following, there's no guarantee that it'll have that same amount of backing. And so you always need to trim up your team in those early stages of development, and then they ramp up until launch, and then they trim down again. So it's, again, from the outside looking in, layoffs never good. It seems to reflect like an unhealthy game or an unsuccessful game. Um, but in a way, there is a sort of like cyclical nature to them. And yet the cyclical nature isn't really what's at play here. And I think that's what really raised a lot of eyebrows.
So you two brought up a lot of great points, but something is muddying the waters in that kind of after this story broke of like, they got laid off and everyone was kind of digesting of like, how the heck can you lay someone off after this, this game is making you so much money. There was another report that came in that the CEO of NetEase, the company that's responsible for Marvel Rivals, almost canceled Marvel Rivals. Like basically, he's quoted as saying, in essence, I only want games that are going to be making me obscene amounts of money. And I don't even think this game has the potential. It'll make some money, but it's not going to be the Scrooge McDuck level of money that I am looking for. So that to me is sort of like worrying in that like it feels like these CEOs are just like their brains are just cooked.
yeah.
Like if it ain't making that line go up and not just up but way up, then we're just gonna start cutting people. We're gonna start canceling projects and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is important, I think, to put onto that. That was a report out of Forbes, and definitely does add an extra kind of layer to this. And actually, I think it ties back to Aiden's initial point when we were talking about double A studios and triple A studios. One of the reasons why the CEO had mentioned, thinking about canceling it entirely, was the obscene amount of licensing costs associated with Marvel Rivals and Disney, right? And so, like, when you have a game like Marvel Rivals, like, first of all, Disney is saying, you better take damn good care of Marvel. Like, you better take damn good care of our IP, because this is very, very precious and very expensive for us. And therefore, they kind of shift that cost um, onto the company. Um, but yeah, I think that the CEO is basically saying like, I mean, yes, it was. We thought about canceling it because it was so expensive to try and turn a profit on this, right? And this goes back to that AAA conversation, right? When you've got games that are costing 100 million, 150 million, 200 million dollars between licensing, huge teams, maintenance, big games, like whatever all those various elements that contribute to these very large costs, it becomes like a Herculean effort to justify and hit the mark that makes it worthwhile for all of that cost, right? Um, yeah,
And, like, he also specifically cited wanting to own IP, right? He wanted games that were based on IP that NetEase owned. But you look at Marvel Rivals and its success, and it hinges especially on the Marvel connection and that IP. You look at the flip side, and that's Concord, and that was a new IP that just
right,
completely crashed. Like, things in the live service space are not doing well right now, and existing IP like Marvel is a strong foundation to build from, to find and have hopefully have some sort of success. Like, the idea that Marvel Rivals isn't doing well enough, and again, it comes back to Alan's point that, like, they don't just wanna make money, they wanna make obscene amounts of money. And that's just broken logic, and the fact that something like Marvel couldn't get you to the point where you're turning profit, that then, those steady, reliable projects are supposed to bankroll the risky stuff, the new IPs, the real home run swings that might in the future become, your Fortnite or whatever, Five Nights at Freddy's.
right,
You need strong, reliable foundations, and that's what a partnership with somebody like Marvel does, even if they're having to give a bunch of the profits in licensing fees back to Marvel. And I think Marvel being an American company and NetEase specifically and in a high profile way, sort of pulling out of the United States tells you that there is that connection there, right? Like, they are probably not looking at doing licensing deals with American companies as much, as
right.
maybe you would have expected after the success of Rivals.
Yeah, and I think that also comes back to again the actions of the current administration as well, because companies are not necessarily feeling the confidence to engage in international business, right? Like whether it's licensing, et cetera, because they feel as though the administration will uh, theoretically be much more um, what's the word I'm looking for, favorable to American companies, like beyond the point of like usual standard like political behavior, right? Like typically there is some sort of gentleman's agreement, right? Like understanding that you know if companies are engaging in certain behaviors, like federal government will step in when there's like overreach or if there's monopolies going on, et cetera. But the behavior of this administration over the past month makes it seem like the president could just wake up one day and decide that he doesn't want it to seem like he's weak on China for some reason, and then begin to implement some ridiculous tariffs, some ridiculous sort of penalties, things that could uh, in any standard administration like not happen, and threaten the basically threaten that company's ability to operate in the United States in a functional way. So,
I mean, we saw what happened when, TikTok was banned, and that took down a few games, right?
yeah,
At the same time during that, ban. I think was it Marvel Snap that went down?
yeah, Marvel Snap
Right?
went down, yeah, for like
Um
24, 48 hours.
And, like, companies are watching that. They're seeing that happen, and that sort of instability is something that they are they want money from these regions, but doing business within those regions becomes, more daunting when you have a volatile administration the way that you do. It's funny that we're talking about this right now because as we're recording, I'm also seeing that, James Gunn is now talking about wanting to make a DC equivalent of Marvel Rivals. They're talking to,
Yeah,
like, Warner
that's the
Bros.
announcement. I was chatting with
Just
my
don't.
buddy.
Were you?
yesterday.
Don't, it's over, James. Just let it
Yeah.
go.
Yeah,
We
I
don't
mean, that's
know.
emblematic of something else entirely, like, DC always sort of, like, chasing what Marvel's doing, but it
Yeah.
is funny how, like, some companies, like NetEase are like, "Oh, we don't really want IP, we don't wanna work, we want our own thing," and then you see somebody like DC and Warner Brothers being like, "Hey, wait, like, we wanna do that. We're happy with,
Right.
only
And yeah.
bucketfuls of money instead of swimming pools of money," or whatever.
And oh man, that's super interesting because now right, James Gunn is basically like, well, maybe NetEase will like our licensing agreements, right? Like NetEase like maybe takes a step back and they provide them with a more favorable, you know, contract or structure or something, or another company that's um, adjacent to what NetEase does doing it. That's interesting. I did see that DC had a major announcement end quote slated for today. I did not realize it was going to be, oh, by the way, we're going to try and make a Marvel Rivals too.
Well, it
um,
takes years to make a game like that, right? Like, it's just so
yeah.
funny to me to be chasing something that's popular right now and making an announcement that, like, 3 years from now, we're gonna have this thing, and it's like,
Yeah,
kind of
that's
turning.
crazy to
Like,
me.
seriously, like, James, just send me a check for like 5K and just tell everybody Alan said no. It's a terrible idea. There you go.
Yeah.
I just saved you a hundred
Consulting fee.
million dollars,
Yeah.
and all you had to give me was 5K and blame me.
Low consulting fees. I mean, I'll tell you that for 45. Yeah, it does seem really interesting to me that they would make that announcement to your point, Aiden, like the idea that it's like turning a cruise ship. Like it's not going to happen quickly, right? Like there's no way that you're going to be able to get that property up and running and get that game up and running. It would be more impactful for James Gunn to come out and say, look, we really love seeing our properties in video games, right? Like we love seeing our properties when they're brought to life in this format. And we've identified a handful of really great AA studios that are going to be releasing a Green Lantern game, a Batman game, a Flash game, right? Like whatever the case might be, right? To basically make a DCU of video games, like and like with some milestones, right? Like with like, here's the game that's coming first, here's the game that's coming next, like a 5-year timeline, and as opposed to being like we're going to build a humongous live service game that's going to take us 5 to 6 years even to get into alpha, and by the time we get there people might not even like live service games anymore, or they're going to be playing Call of Duty 12 or whatever the heck is out there. Like that's so wild to
It just kinda goes to show how reactionary just the entertainment industry is on top of the video game industry. It's always chasing those trends, right? Like, it's easy for us, like, we can sit back and say, like, live service games, outside of the ones that are, like, already super successful, struggle, right? Like, introducing a new live service game is hard, and that's what makes Marvel Rivals' success and sort of prominence so interesting because it managed to break out of that.
Well, they feel like DC can do that too, I guess, is what James is thinking. He's like,
Yeah,
well, Marvel was able to break through the ceiling because it's Marvel.
yeah.
We'll be able to break through the ceiling because we're DC.
I love it because that's just like classic DC, right? Like they always just seem to think they can do what Marvel can do, and then it just never really works out that way for them. But
I loved Guardians of the Galaxy, by the way. Thanks, James. It was a it was a great trilogy. I'm still excited for Superman. I hope that it's awesome. Um, but yeah, this is not the move. I I'm flabbergasted to be honest. Um, Okay. So yeah, I mean, kind of circling back here, and we've talked about it before, like what does success look like? Like if you when you think about a successful video game in recent memory, what comes to mind? And like what does that look like, from a like a professional standpoint, right? Like sure, I mean, I think if you turn over each of these rocks, right, um for a successful game, you'll find layoffs underneath probably. Any any successful game, you'll probably find the same thing. But I'm just curious, like, what are the other elements that makes a successful game? Um, and maybe, studios that are able to execute on that success in a more effective manner,
yeah,
you know.
Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is the big one, like
Mm.
the AAA space.
Mhm.
It exceeded sales expectations, I think, which is so rare for a Square Enix game these days. Um, and they did it because they bucked the trend of what you were describing earlier of like that those sort of cyclical, like routine layoffs of shrinking and growing teams through development and like the fallow periods, right? They did it by keeping the team together, moving straight into the next project, and retaining institutional knowledge and experience. So they were able to make a game that was so big, so polished, and so rich in a fairly short period of time as far as like AAA game development goes. Because they brought together a team, trusted them to do their thing, and didn't, kind of throw them all to the wayside after remake launched. And I look at Final Fantasy VII Rebirth as like a major success in the AAA space. Is it the biggest, highest earning game of the year? Like, no, it's not. But it did what it needed to do, and I think that as like a sort of goal for AAA games, especially like within series, would be a really good place to be. Like, make a game that relies on a really experienced team and doesn't need to sell, 30 million copies to be
Yeah.
successful because you've had efficient like game development processes. You've contrast that against 16, Final Fantasy 16, which it sold pretty well, but Square Enix has been pretty open that they were disappointed with, its performance relative to the costs and what they expected of it. Um, and then flip side too, like Alan brought it up earlier, but Balatro, right? Like Balatro set the world on fire and
Just one
inspired
guy,
one
just
Yeah,
person.
one
one
dude in
guy
the
making a
basement.
lot of money right now.
I don't know, man, like one guy can do all of that, right? And I'm not like obviously one single like developers can't make every game out there, but we
Right.
do live in an environment where small dev teams, you look at Astrobot, like that's another one with like it
Yeah.
was one guy, but it was a small team that's
Yeah.
stuck together for a long time, was given a lot of leeway and space, and they put out, one of the best games of the year, and the development costs, I'm sure, were a fraction of larger games.
Yeah.
And I'd love to see more of that too.
I'm looking this up really quick because uh yeah, so I mean about the estimate is about 69 million for Astrobot development. Well, no, actually, like somewhere between 55 and 70, somewhere in there, for Astrobot. But to your point, like it ended up being like the one of the best performing games of the year, both critically and financially. Um,
And he's so polished. Like that feels like that game. Like it's a tiny team, but they hit out of the park. Like it's not like beautiful in a way of like a God of War or Last of Us, but it's really beautiful like in its own way, and it has its own style and art direction. So I think that games like that are more the way forward than like obviously it's nice to get like the God of Wars and the Last of Us. But I think that company should probably focus more on sort of like that Astrobot level, and you can still have something that's really fun and looks really great.
yeah. Yeah, I think before we move on to the next topic, the example that comes to my mind is, you go to the House of Nintendo, right? You look at more specifically in recent memory, Super Mario Wonder. Like, there were a couple of stories that were out there that basically shared their methodology for building the game was basically it'll be done when it's done. Take as much time as you need. Um, don't mess with it, don't mess with be creative, bring your ideas. And a lot of that team is the same team that's been doing Mario games forever and ever, right? Part of the reason why Nintendo is so successful at developing games so consistently, right? When you go to a restaurant and one of the telltale signs of a great restaurant is consistency. You order a burger, it's the best burger you've ever had. The first time, the third time, the seventh time, the 20th time, right? That is a great restaurant if they can maintain that consistency. It's the same thing with Nintendo, right? They put out a game. Now, people are probably like, it's not consistent. Zelda sucks sometimes, whatever. But you get the argument is basically like you get those folks who are familiar with the workflow, who knows, how Nintendo likes games developed. They've been working together for a long time. They get each other, they understand each other's weaknesses and strengths and kind of complement each other. And then you have a functional team that's able to deliver these iconic IPs, consistently at high quality. Um, and I mean, that's what I think of. Like when I think of like a successful game model, like a successful game company, I think Nintendo, like just as a whole, like kind of as a monolith.
Yeah,
And
but also I think
you know,
that the Switch hardware itself kind of allowed for that to be what it is because like, they weren't thinking of like, oh yeah, how do I put, ray tracing and how do I kick this up to
yeah, there's definitely some
464.
technical elements to consider, and yeah,
Yeah, so I
on
think
top
that
of it.
once I think the limitations of the Switch hardware were like good not just for the technical side, but also to like it challenges them sort of like creatively, and that's why they're able to come out with so many good games this generation.
Yeah,
Trouble with Nintendo is their success is not replicatable, right? It's
yeah,
hundreds of years, or not hundreds, but like well over 100 years at this
yeah,
point of like business success and you know ingenuity and risk taking and you know the perseverance to get through those rocky periods, right? Where other companies would look at selling when they hit something like the Wii U or
right,
the GameCube,
yeah,
when like, everything looked doomed. Nintendo persevered and they believe in their business approach, and then that lets them kind of resurge the way that they do.
yeah,
So I just don't know that like it's almost impossible for other companies to like learn from Nintendo at this point because they
yeah,
just
Yeah, like a unique corporate culture there.
what was that?
They have a unique corporate culture there,
Yeah,
basically.
the corporate culture is
Hard
just
to copy.
so different. And
yeah,
they don't do a lot of layoffs. I know that they do like a lot of contract work and they sort of hide their layoffs and their kind of like workforce management in clever ways, but retaining talent is just such an important aspect in the video game industry, and it just is not there in the Western studios. They just do not retain institutional knowledge and experience, and that shows because when you have to start over from scratch every time, you're just
yeah,
gonna run into trouble. Jason Schreier's, latest book about Blizzard really dives into why, like, institutional knowledge and experience and, like, teams working together consistently over multiple projects, why that creates, companies like peak Blizzard, and why they were
yeah.
able to make classic game after classic game after classic game, and why that sort of fell off as they were eaten up by larger corporate entities.
Yeah, and before we move on, I think there is a pretty good example of this, and that's in Larian Studios. You know, I think I think Larian is currently doing that, and that is probably part of the reason why Baldur's Gate 3, kind of stood out, and I think people are kind of just waiting on pins and needles for whatever's next from them as well. But like, I get I hear what you're saying. I think it's difficult to ask you know game publishers and developers like, oh, just be like Nintendo.
Yeah.
But I do think there are definitely best practices that can be pulled in terms of like, okay, how can we better retain this talent, right? How can we better build like in programming, I think it's like a tiger team, right? Like how can we build this like small, focused, dedicated team that we can carry from one project to the next, one game to the next, right? To start building that core
I
identity of
I
like
don't
the
think
game
we can
studio.
also, like, undersell Nintendo's diversification in the handheld market, and
Mm,
their ability to kinda, like, train up talent in smaller projects, right? Like, you have, what's the guy who directed, like, Tears of the Kingdom? But he started, with Capcom on some of the handheld Zeldas, and I think that Nintendo diversifying and having this avenue for smaller, like, projects where they could take risks and experiment. The costs weren't prohibitive. It wasn't as scary, like if a game didn't take off. They constantly used handheld devices as a place just to test out game design boundaries,
right.
test out
Yeah.
new ideas before they adopted them into larger, more expensive console games. And because they had that space to do so, they were able to innovate in ways that other companies who were, having to hedge on, big, more expensive titles would be more risk averse. And I think Nintendo has always succeeded because of that. Just the lower costs reduce the potential for disaster if experimentation.
Yeah. No, that's a fantastic point. I think, when you have essentially a sandbox in the form of like the Game Boy Color, like the especially the old hands that have been around for a while. And that's a Hidemaru Fujibayashi, by the way, Fujibayashi. He was a director for Tears of the Kingdom. Um, so yeah, I think that when you have those opportunities to basically have your talent be taking risks and doing those experiments on games that at the end of the day don't require a fraction of a percentage of a fraction of a fraction of a percentage of what even a double A game would cost these days. Of course it's going to allow you to further refine your skills and be able to port it into a larger game, a larger platform, versus having to develop a really great PS2 game or PS3 game like right off the jump, right? Even back then, and now even more so, right? Like you want to try and develop a PS5 Pro game, it's gonna, you know, that's where those indie games like Balatro, like and where the Steam Deck and the Steam Marketplace can allow smaller creators and studios to make those sorts of experiments, but they have to be able to pay the bills and keep the lights on. Um, yeah, this topic went on quite a bit longer than I was expecting to, but that's okay. We'll go ahead and just transition. We'll just make this one maybe a bit of a quicker chat, and that is on generative AI in game development. And this kind of came, it's been in the orbit of conversation for a while in game dev, but this came back around because Microsoft and Xbox were pushing forward with the release of Muse, which is a generative AI model, and it's basically designed to help build out physics and 3D environments in a game and generate visuals and reactions to players' movements. Per Megan uh, Faro Manesh at Wired. Um, so this started a broader conversation, right, in terms of like game developers not really wanting to incorporate generative AI because of the uh, pushback that a lot of consumers uh, are sharing with the broader populace. Like if they see a game that looks like it has AI in it, they don't want to touch it. But also at the same time, all these companies are basically saying we need to get more AI in here. Stakeholders saying we want AI on our toasters. Like let's keep going. And so this kind of push and pull between where corporate is on AI integration and usage and where game developers and game publishers are with using these tools. And so yeah, Aiden, I guess I'm curious what you think about this kind of continuing conversation and where this tension is right now.
Yeah, I mean it's funny because I think you have this issue of like the left hand and the right hand doing their own things, not talking to each other. Because today it was also announced that Microsoft is like pulling out funding and drawing back from funding on a lot of the AI data center leases that they've sort of committed to. And so you see Microsoft on one hand saying, "Hey, wait, maybe we need to like slow down on AI. We're not seeing opportunity for return the way we thought we would." And then you had seen Microsoft also going deep in their games division and be like, "Hey, here are all these, you know, AI tools that we think are gonna, help people make games or play games." And you can see sort of like the company, the part of the company required to make money is sort of stuck paying that sunk cost fallacy tax. And the gaming division is trying to be like, okay, like AI, like we got to figure out how to make money off of AI. And then the part of the company that spends money is like, "Oh, hold up, maybe we're not as deep on AI as we wanna be, or maybe we're too deep on AI and we wanna pull back." So that left
Yeah.
hand, right hand thing is really coming through because, as you said, the response to stuff like Muse and, like, then there was also the, like, absurd comments about emulating old games and letting AIs, like, watch old games and then recreate them
Oh
instead of
yeah,
emulating code, like
that was so
that
stupid.
was like, the response to that was even, like, worse, like, nobody wants any of this stuff, and that's just so emblematic of AI, like, do things properly,
Yeah.
like, with the game emulation thing, it's like, It's like trying to sell people like, "Hey, like, we could give you an AI and it would go and look at the Mona Lisa and then recreate that with its own tools and show you the Mona Lisa." And it's like, "Well, just show me a photo of the Mona Lisa. Don't
Yeah,
show me an AI interpretation of the photo, like a photo of the Mona Lisa. Just show me the actual thing."
right.
Nobody wants this, right?
Yeah,
But like they've committed so much money to it that they get caught up in that sunk cost fallacy of trying to deliver something that sounds exciting, but none of it sounds exciting. All of it sounds like a major stretch because it doesn't do anything. It doesn't solve problems that exist. AI is great at solving like problems that, you know, humans are bad at. Like let's let it find the things that humans are bad at, large data sample like analysis, stuff like that, right?
hmm,
Um, Stop trying to get it to do the things that humans are good at. This is, the corporate billionaire class saying, "Hey, wouldn't it be better if we could run our businesses without having to pay humans?" And that's
yeah,
the end goal here.
yeah,
But it's just like
yeah,
it's just not panning out. Like regular people think AI is dumb at this point, right? Like,
yeah.
not just the, like, really tuned in online, people like us, but you're starting to see pushback, like, everywhere. Like, people don't wanna see AI popping up in every single app they use. And I think as that sentiment becomes more popular, you're gonna see these companies and Ed Zitron writes about this all the time, like the bubble crash. The signs are there that the AI bubble is gonna crash, and it's gonna be ugly. There's so much money wrapped up in it, and it's
Hmm.
gonna be far-reaching when it happens, I think.
And that's kind of what I'm thinking because when you see these conversations online, you get a lot of people who are like, you know, and even in that Wired article, right? Like nobody wants this was sort of like the prevailing argument, right? Like nobody wants this development, nobody wants this tool. But to your point, the amount of investment that's been made, the conversations are always like, why doesn't somebody just say like, no, this is dumb, we shouldn't move forward with AI stuff? And it's like, because they've spent billions and billions and billions of dollars, and they are not going to, basically they want to keep the music going, right? As long as the music's playing, they're getting paid. And that goes for all the folks who are currently in the industry who are still employed, right? They're looking over this kind of like hellish, desolate landscape of the job market right now, and they're like looking at their job and they're thinking, well, if I just sort of like nod and be like, yeah, we can explore AI stuff, sure, and that's what keeps the music on, then that's what they're going to do, and I do not blame them for it, right? um I think that, yeah.
It's too bad because there's so many fields where people who are developing like large language models and machine learning applications could be providing a lot of good and future potential to like humanity, right? Like AI as we think of it, and like there's a separation between generative AI and like other types of AI, but like it has large applications in the medical field, for instance, but it's
Right,
hard to make money off of that, or it's hard to see how to make money off of that. And so, all of the people, putting money, their time into building tools in the video game industry to create features that nobody really wants, like you say, they're making a lot of money doing this. They're doing something they're really interested in. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we want to see tools applied to making, life easier so that humans can do the things that want to do and are good at. And whether that's keeping us healthy or whether that's reducing sort of repetitive tasks in our life that are just harder than they need to be because we don't have existing tools. And so like the industry itself, and it is full of people who are heavily invested in this idea of using computers to make things easier or better. But when you have the C suite coming in and being like, hey, like instead of like, putting this time and energy into using machine learning to do early detection of cancer, let's see if we can get it to replace all of our, graphics people and get that
right,
team down from 150 to like 12.
right,
Yeah, because the thing is that like this model that they showed off is actually really impressive compared to others. Because like it was like 2 months ago, Google did a kind of a similar thing, but like it'll only do it for like a minute, and then it kind of just forgets and it tries to generate like a whole new thing. For this one, it actually like kind of remembers. Like you can turn around, let's say, and face your camera north, and then like 2 minutes later, turn around and look back south, and it'll still have all that stuff in place, but it's still super early. Like, you literally have to squint because the data that it generated is like the size of a postage stamp. Like, literally, like, it's tiny. And like it's nowhere near being able to produce a whole game. But you can see that's the direction that it's definitely going in. And even Satya Nadella, with his little, Cook CEO brain, like the rest of the other CEOs, is like went on a podcast yesterday, or it might have been 2 days ago, and was like, "Yeah, we're gonna have a catalog of these Gen AI made games on Xbox." So like that's a thing
Mm,
that he wants to do. Um,
yeah.
so ultimately, will the AI be good enough to make a game worth putting, on Xbox and like championing before the bubble burst? Who knows? Probably not. Because
No.
again, this is extremely early.
My money's on no. uh,
How
I
long
think.
what I wanna know is how long until we're paying a premium for, like, handcrafted, human-made experience,
It's gonna circle back around, isn't it?
right? Like, if people
100%.
are gonna want human-made experiences after the market is flooded with, like, generative AI garbage, and we're gonna just end up having to pay more for it. Like, I can see that happening already, and it
I mean, there's already all these like dystopian kind of reflections of like bots that are current like AI bots that are currently scraping AI written articles to generate more AI content for like basically the robots are talking to themselves, right? Like
Yeah, like right
or
now, in terms of like the game space, I know Steam Next Fest is coming up, so like a lot of demos for upcoming games, and like people are really complaining about like there's just so much AI slop here that it's really hard to find like the good gems by good indie studios.
yeah, yeah. I do think that it's looping back around, right? I think ultimately the the prevalence of AI is going to drive the yearning for that like human connection again. But in the meantime, right, it will utterly devastate the market. In the meantime, it's going to like utterly like hollow out the industry because all of these professionals who otherwise would be doing um, these mid-level graphic design jobs, low and mid-level graphic design jobs, like we're already seeing those are getting quickly snapped up by AI tools and models. And um, yeah, it's just really unfortunate just how much the companies are putting on this bet. And that when they put it all red and the roulette's gonna land on black, like the ball's already in like the black, right? It's already there. And the wheel's just spinning around. They're just waiting for it to stop and call it, so um that's kind of where we're at. Anyways, it's been a blast as usual chatting with you both. Um, and that's all that we have for today. So, thank you all again for tuning in. Please, if you like what you're listening to, leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, may your save points never be too far away. See you next time.
See ya.
Bye.